to our webinar this afternoon. I'm going to get right started with the objectives for today's session. So when I was putting this together, one of the things that I wanted to do was to try to help you to understand the conceptual underpinnings of the WISC-V, and particularly the scores that are earned on the WISC-V, so that you know when and how to use this versatile instrument. And throughout today's session, we'll go ahead and analyze and report some WISC-V data, and I hope to be able to demonstrate how you can do that in an understandable manner for educators and parents, and then of course also use the specific WISC-V test results to answer referral questions in the case of SAM. Now, you should have received a handout last week with the test scores, and then I know Sherry sent out the specific handout of slides that we'll be going through today. I didn't include every single slide, but you should have those that allow you to take notes and be able to address some of the key concepts that we'll be presenting today. So first off, I wanted to just get your thoughts about when you're working with a student, and I see I have a typo. I wrote SAME instead of SAM. A billion times I've looked at this, but what are some possible reasons as to why a student like Sam might not be finishing his work on time? Just go ahead and type your thoughts into the chat box. I'll give it just a few moments. What could be some reasons why Sam isn't finishing his work on time? So I see attentional difficulties, he doesn't understand instructions, slow processing speed, depression, perfectionistic. Lots of good ideas coming through here. Executive functioning weaknesses, poor time management. So lots of really good hypotheses coming through. One of the things that I think is important for us to think of is that when we look at the students that we're working with in the classroom, we want to think about the process of learning. And as we discuss the WISC-V, I want you to specifically think about what the subtests and the index scores represent and what they have to do with the process of learning, and why it might be important to understand those conditions under which a child like Sam performs well and those in which he might experience some difficulty. So consider those basic processes, for example, that are related to input as well as output. How does one like Sam go about acquiring skills and demonstrating what he knows? And that's a big component here, is that there seems to be a real performance-based kind of a deficit, and he has a lot of trouble demonstrating what he knows. How does he go about solving problems? And what processes and behaviors is he recruiting to perform the various kinds of tasks that are expected? Now, the performance of tasks may involve language, of course, could involve sensory motor functioning, visual functioning, auditory, many, many different areas. And certainly as you were putting in your ideas as to why a child like Sam might be experiencing difficulty getting his work done in the classroom, it could be related to multiple factors. Obviously, we know that emotions and behavior can play a big role in what students do in the classroom. It could be poor teaching. Hopefully we've already established that Sam is not just a casualty of poor instruction because we've gone through some of the RTI or multi-tiered support processes that we have in school. But depending upon the type of environment you're working in, you may or may not have had that opportunity. We know that environment can certainly play a huge role. Sam may be coming to school hungry and not even able to focus because of something that's going on in his home environment. And then, of course, issues related to how Sam is functioning, his attention, his concentration, his ability to connect and process ideas and concepts and things of that nature. Now, you may wonder why I have this magnifying glass here. And, this is an image that I often associate with being a detective, but also being a good clinician. And specifically, I think that's what we're doing when we are engaging in an assessment, because we need to really think about and understand the variables that are coming into play between the environment and the student. So we need to think about the brain and the behavior-based characteristics that influence how a child is performing in the classroom. And a skillful clinician is just like a skilled detective in my mind. How you go about collecting and putting the information together really matters. If you are sloppy or narrow thinking as a detective, then you may either destroy or miss clues along the way. And so it's important for us as clinicians to think about the variety of cognitive tasks that are assessed with a measure like the WISC-V. And I like to think of it as a relatively efficient, standardized research protocol or evidence collection process that allows me to collect many samples of behavior. And here I'm trying to solve the puzzle of learning or demonstration of what has been learned, not a crime like a CSI detective. And of course, the WISC-V isn't going to give me all of the answers, but it does give me a good window into a lot. And that is if I use it for more than just the full scale IQ, or even just looking at those index or ancillary scores. So let's think about Sam and what we know about him. As I said, I'm going to walk through this case study today, and hopefully I'll have enough time to get all the way through it. Just some background on Sam. He had a great teacher who was already doing quite a bit of intervention, but he was experiencing chronic work production issues both at home and in school. There were some behavioral issues as well, but the fact of the matter is his academic achievement really wasn't suffering in terms of the acquisition of specific skills. Rather, he was just having difficulty demonstrating and performing these academic tasks on a consistent basis. In reality, he learned most things with a pretty high degree of accuracy and actually learned them relatively quickly in terms of acquiring skills. So in my assessment battery, I considered a number of different factors. And as I mentioned, I didn't do a whole lot of academic achievement testing because I felt like I had a pretty good sense of where the academics were going into this. Rather, I was going into this assessment trying to answer some specific questions related more to the work production and understanding why he had some difficulties in this area. So as we look at Sam's case, we can quickly see that issues related to his performance in class really don't seem to be related to any issues with verbal cognitive abilities. We hadn't necessarily hypothesized that this would be related to the root cause, but one of the advantages of using the verbal comprehension index is that it provides a relatively quick way to gain some standard data and to develop further insights into Sam's performance. So we can see that he is able to access and apply his word knowledge. He demonstrates very good verbal concept formation, reasoning, and expression. He uses that strong word knowledge acquisition capacity and fairly effective retrieval strategies as he's solving problems. So, in this particular case, and I'm just showing you a few of the scores. You have all of the scores in the sample report. In this particular case, as we said, verbal comprehension is not really related to the primary issue. For another student, though, one of the reasons why he or she might have had difficulty finishing work on time certainly could have been related to poorly developed word knowledge, difficulties in retrieving acquired information, and so forth. But this isn't the case for Sam. What about visual spatial skills? So as we look at the WISC-V and we think about the performance on the visual spatial index, there are many task demands that are part of visual spatial reasoning. And low scores, of course, can occur for a variety of reasons. When you think about what a high score means on VSI, that indicates a well-developed capacity to integrate and apply spatial reasoning. It indicates well-developed perception of visual details and visual analysis, whereas low scores might be due to deficits in spatial processing. It might be difficulty with visual discrimination or poor visual attention. In the classroom, you might see children who have visual spatial weaknesses showing difficulty with drawing or writing or building or letter formation. At advanced levels, you might see trouble with calculus or geometry, for example. You may see that some of the kids who have VSI weaknesses have trouble with body space awareness. But in the classroom, we really weren't seeing a lot of these kinds of things with Sam, although when it came to writing, that was one of the areas that was quite slow for him. He really wasn't getting a lot of the written work done in a timely manner. So let's see how he does. But one thing I want to remind us that when we get our referrals, kids are referred because of perceived difficulties in some areas. And sometimes, of course, that's associated with a perception that a child either cannot or will not perform a task. And part of what we're trying to do with the WISC-V is to help to distinguish between whether the child can't versus won't, and also is it a matter of execution or performance in terms of alignment to what the child or the teacher is expecting. So in Sam's case, again, we specifically see that he has some very well-developed visual spatial skills. You can see his score is very strong, just as it was with the verbal comprehension area. And again, you only see a snapshot of the scores here. You can certainly refer to the larger score report for additional information as well. But as we take a look a little bit further, one of the things that we see is that block design, is actually a strength for Sam. We see that when it comes to constructional capabilities, he is very strong there. So, so far we're not really uncovering, much in terms of, anything that is specifically pinpointing why Sam is slower in the classroom. Now, for some of the kids that we work with, what we see is that there may be some issues with block design errors. I wouldn't overinterpret anything in this particular case. You can see that he did have some errors, but you're really looking for more of a pattern of consistent errors when you interpret a dimensional error like that. So we really, again, aren't seeing much in the testing that we've done thus far. However, it seems like we've ruled out verbally based, issues. It seems like we've ruled out abstract visual spatial analysis as some reasons behind Sam's difficulties. But we've also gained some valuable information. Specifically, one of the things that we're able to describe right now are some strengths that Sam has. And that's important because at the time the referral was made, teachers and parents were a little bit down on Sam and what he was doing and what his performance was in the classroom. Other significant observations, though, that we gained during the standardized assessment was that Sam didn't make guesses when it came to definitions of words. He also seemed to benefit from being able to talk things through. And he liked to take a fairly analytic kind of a style in problem solving. So there were a few retrieval gaps, and Sam would say, well, I've seen that word, but I just can't remember the exact definition. But he wasn't really willing to guess. He clearly was able to visualize and construct things. He really didn't hesitate too much in those kinds of tasks that were not paper and pencil oriented. So, again, we don't have specific reasons just yet as to why Sam is experiencing difficulty completing his assignments in a timely fashion, but we've ruled out a few things, and we do have some meaningful observations. So let's continue and think about fluid reasoning. So based upon Sam's parent and his teacher reports, we really hadn't seen that Sam was experiencing significant difficulty in actually acquiring information. Rather, it's more in demonstrating what he knows in a consistent manner. Therefore, I really wasn't going into this assessment expecting that his fluid reasoning would be low. But at this point, we're still trying to understand the whole child and describe both his strengths and his needs. So you already know, I'm sure, that fluid reasoning measures the student's ability to detect important elements among visual objects to understand their underlying conceptual relationship, and then to apply that conceptual knowledge. So it requires things like inductive and quantitative reasoning, broad visual intelligence, simultaneous processing, and abstract thinking. So, is he slow but accurate with these skills? We might have an opportunity to see that in some of the testing that we do here. Now, being slow or accurate in terms of your ability to engage in abstract analytical thinking is something that could be important. So this is an example of abstract analytical thinking, and this comes from the report that I wrote up regarding the WISC-V results, or the full evaluation results actually for Sam. And so what I want you to think about is that when we think about the process of analyzing information, whether it's verbal or whether it's visually based, we need to consider, so how long does it take a student or a person to put that analysis together? For example, when I interpreted these WISC-V results, how long did it take me to do that? I may have reasoned through it faster than I could put it in words, verbally or in writing. I remember that when I had to dictate my reports, that seems like a very long time ago, it took me much, much longer to write a report as opposed to typing it out in word processing. But also, how quickly can I do this in comparison to my peers? What about my own expectations or the expectations of others, and how does that impact what I'm doing? Likewise, when I think about the importance of fluid reasoning and the process of connecting information, it's all about also rapidly making connections between various pieces of information and putting that together at a more abstract level. And I want you to consider and think about how this could aid the retrieval process in the classroom and demonstrating what you know within the classroom. Many times we see, for example, that a student may have some isolated facts, and they may have memorized all of those facts. However, they haven't really gone through the process of connecting those and creating a larger, more connected schema, if you will. Or they haven't really been able to put together and understand all of the different relationships that go together. If we think about this, it's one of the important components for many students as they attempt to demonstrate what they learn. This ability to have multiple connections to get to the information that you need to demonstrate what you know, for example. I like to use the analogy of being in an unfamiliar city and having to knowing, or a less familiar city, and knowing one way to get somewhere. Well, what happens if there's a major traffic jam in that particular area? If you don't have multiple ways of getting to the same thing, then you're obviously going to be a little bit impacted. And it's the same thing with getting to and showing what we know and what we learn. And as I said, those expectations are an important component because I have my own expectations, I have my teacher's expectations, as well as, of course, my parents and so forth. So just to make sure that we're on the same page. So what can happen in the classroom or in the family or to the student when there's an expectation mismatch? So teachers think you should be able to do something, but you can't. Or a parent thinks you should do something and you can't. Check off anything that you think can happen when there's an expectation mismatch between what's happening for a student and the expectations that he or she is facing. There are a lot of right answers here, and there's one that I'm not sure I would check. So again, I'll just to keep things moving, I'm going to go ahead here and let you see where some of the results are. As you can see, there's there are certainly multiple things that can happen, and when we look at rising above the expectations, if somebody is very resilient and has a lot of resources, then maybe it doesn't matter. I know I've worked with lots of kids who have shut down and acted out, and certainly had some feelings of inadequacy along the way, as well as some of the other associated fallouts. So getting back to specifically fluid reasoning in our case, what opportunities are there when I'm administering the fluid reasoning task to evaluate the impact of time pressure or the impact of quantitative reasoning skills, for example? So specifically in Sam's case, as we look at his results, and I'll show that on the next slide, one of the things we will want to pay attention to is, of course, that matrix reasoning has a very has a 30-second guideline. So it's a looser guideline that is designed to really keep the test session moving along and prevent the student from becoming frustrated or fatigued. But you really need to take a lot of cues from the student's behavior and how the child is performing on those items in terms of looking at that 30-second guideline. On the flip side, when you think about figure weights and arithmetic, there are certainly quantitative concepts involved and a fair degree of working memory that is also involved. And that might slow somebody down. And ultimately, of course, there are those very strict time limits associated with both figure weights and arithmetic. Now, ultimately, when I looked at some of the ancillary scores, Sam's quantitative reasoning index was 117. So I didn't necessarily see evidence that reasoning with quantitative information was problematic in his case either. But when I look at the fluid reasoning as compared to verbal comprehension and some of the other areas, again, I've got a very strong reasoning score here, falling at the 98th percentile, confidence interval of 122 to 136 for fluid reasoning, and compared to working memory at a 94 and processing speed at 100, this is quite different. So one of the elements that may be coming into play with Sam could possibly be some mismatch between his very well-developed reasoning capabilities and his ability to engage in working memory tasks and to complete very basic kinds of things in a quick manner with the processing speed tasks. But let's take a look at things a little bit further. When I look at his performance on the subtests, I see in fact that matrix reasoning is a relative strength. And of course, I mentioned before that this is a subtest without specific time limits, but one of the things that was important were my behavioral observations during the matrix reasoning task, for example. And one of the things that I saw consistently over my evaluation with Sam was that he became especially motivated to perform, regardless of time limits, on tasks that he found to be very challenging or tasks that he really enjoyed doing. Specifically on matrix reasoning, he really seemed to enjoy analyzing those visual patterns and locating what made sense in the sequence. And he became very motivated and often talked about how much he enjoyed these kinds of tasks. So that's one thing that may be becoming important. Another thing that I might want to pay attention to would be looking at figure weights versus the ancillary task of arithmetic. And I might want to think about the working memory demands as well. There was a significant difference between figure weights and arithmetic in terms of this pairwise comparison. It's a relatively atypical difference with a base rate of 11%. And one of the things that I might begin to think about in Sam's case would be all of the working memory demands that are associated with arithmetic. There's certainly a lot more language and the requirement to distinguish between what's relevant and irrelevant when you are completing the arithmetic tasks. So I think it's important for us to, particularly in cases like this, I think we want to really make sure that we keep in perspective how complex and multifaceted many of these tasks are. And arithmetic is an excellent example, because if you remember, arithmetic cross-loads in the factor analysis. And clinically, in a case like Sam's, we actually might gain some really helpful information by analyzing his specific test results within this context. The WISC-V integrated would probably be a very helpful tool in this regard, because I would have been able to isolate more of the working memory and the math skills with some of the additional arithmetic process subtests. But I certainly could do that qualitatively as well. So the WISC-V integrated might have been a helpful tool in helping me tease out more of the contributions of working memory and mathematical skills as I was looking at the arithmetic subtest. I didn't have that for this particular instrument, but I think we can gain a lot of very relevant information as we begin to look at cognitive proficiency in working memory, however. So before we look at Sam's, sorry about that, hit that a little too fast. Before we look at Sam's performance, I want you to just think about for a moment the working memory index and what it involves. So in general, it's a measure of verbal and visual working memory, the ability to resist proactive interference. But we also know that at a very basic level, working memory involves attention, concentration, mental control, and reasoning. And we have a good opportunity here to analyze the different components of working memory by looking at Sam's performance on all of the different tasks. So as you saw before, although still within the average range with a score of 94, obviously Sam did not do quite as well compared to his mean performance on all of the other index scores. But it's important for us to think about the composition of this score of 94. And in this case, even though we've got auditory and some visually based working memory as part of the working memory index, it isn't really a case of different modalities, because if I take a look at Sam's ancillary score of auditory working memory at 108, that's not drastically different, but it is meaningful, as I said, to look at how Sam performed many of these tasks and the behaviors that accompanied his task performance. And so in Sam's case, task complexity was played a very interesting role. For some of our kids, as task complexity increases, they become more stressed, and their resources are really taken to the max, and they really have a lot of difficulty. So looking at digit span forward, backward, and sequencing, for example, can be very, very meaningful. But for a child like Sam, where challenge is important and complexity seems to be valued, we actually see the opposite. And so as I look at what makes up that digit span, that overall digit span performance, again, we see that Sam's ability to exert mental control, so his ability to sustain attention, concentrate, encode, it's broadly within the average range, but as we look at how he really was able to do quite well on the more complex tasks like digit span sequencing, that was something important. He recognized these complex tasks as being difficult right away, and he seemed to be able to recruit more of his cognitive resources to say to himself, I need to pay greater attention to this. I need to exert a little bit more effort in order to be successful here. So this is a case, a situation where some of our process scores with the WISC-V might be very helpful. Specifically, some of the contrast scores that are available with WISC-V. I'm not going to go into great detail. We have some other resources that can help you learn more about the contrast scores, but let me show you what they meant for Sam. So here I'm beginning to further describe and analyze some of the core difficulties that Sam likely has in terms of completing work in a timely fashion. We can see that I have some fairly consistent evidence that there are difficulties with attention. I don't only have test data to support that, but I've got some behavioral notes in the report. And by the way, you will have the opportunity to access the full report after this session. But again, I'm not saying that this is necessarily a core problem with encoding or mental manipulation. Rather, it seems to be attention and the ability to recruit proper effort and proper resources in order to do a task well. And so when I think about this, in relationship to how attention difficulties and working memory difficulties may be manifested in the classroom, of course, this has this has something to do with what Sam is experiencing. But again, it's not telling us the whole story, because I need to put in the piece that Sam seems to be able to respond to challenges, get his motivation, up and going, and really, work hard when he recognizes that something is very difficult. Okay, so these are some important components. Now, we all know that when it comes to working memory and processing speed, many times those two are that many times students experience difficulties in both of those areas. So we see that we've got relatively equal performance in terms of the working memory and processing speed. And if you think about it, what influences processing speed, here the child is having to do some paper and pencil work, so there could be motor impacts, there could be difficulties scanning, but we really haven't seen any indications thus far that there's a problem with Sam processing visually based information. Rather, we see some indications of difficulties with concentration. We see cognitive flexibility as an important area potentially in Sam's case. So in looking at Sam in particular, we need to be thinking about where in the cycle are things breaking down for him. And here it's mostly at that output phase. There's really not as much that seems to be going on for Sam at the input stage. When things, though, are not recognized by him as a challenge, he doesn't necessarily pull together all of his effort and all of his resources appropriately. So that output and the input in terms of understanding that it's a challenge, and that may be part of the process that he is going through, is something significant here. We also, of course, have seen from the score report that you had that, lo and behold, there's a 4 on coding. And what do you make of that? I mean, how do you interpret that 4? Certainly, the processing speed index isn't going to be a unitary construct. I've exaggerated some of these differences. This is, of course, not a real case. It is a pseudo case for the purposes of instruction. But when we see a discrepancy like this, it's very important for us to recognize, well, what was it that was actually happening here? And in this particular case, one of the things that we saw were the behaviors, and you'll see when you get the report that the slowness was not really due to that 4 is due to primarily slowness, not any errors, but the slowness was due to the process of putting those designs on paper and really going through a very perfectionistic, very rigid way of completing the task. So in thinking about this and why it's important, certainly one of the things I want us to recognize as part of going through this case analysis is that we are talking about a functional system. And speed and efficiency do several things for a learner. So we know, for example, that poor automaticity is key to learning. It helps to facilitate the learning process. We know that failure to automatize some of the basic skills requires an increase in frontal lobe activity, and therefore there's more effortful processing that is involved, and it doesn't leave a lot of room for further analysis. But if we think about Sam, remember he has at this point in his at this point in his life, his reasoning capabilities are very, very strong. And he's able, I think, to apply some of those well-developed reasoning skills at this juncture to go beyond some of the efficiency issues, but it's starting to create more and more problems. And one of the things that I've seen as a school psychologist for a very long time, I'm not going to tip my hat as to how long, but one of the things that I've seen is that, okay, when you're in second, third grade, fourth grade, these cognitive efficiency problems may or may not cause great concern for a child's performance, but the more advanced they get and the more the work demands increase and the less familiar some of the content becomes, we see that it becomes more and more of an issue. So personally, I think that cognitive functions matter greatly, within this context in particular, and we see it in terms of Sam's unfinished work, his incomplete work. We see this being manifested with some behavioral problems that I really haven't gone into great detail on, simply because we just don't have enough time, in an hour-long session. But when you see these cognitive proficiency difficulties, it certainly does impact what you either learn or what you can demonstrate that you learn, or a combination of both. Now on the WISC-V, we could certainly talk about the CPI, this ancillary score. However, I think it's just as meaningful to talk about the processing speed and the working memory index scores, and in Sam's case, not just to talk about those index scores, but also about his specific performance along the way. But it does raise the question, in this particular situation, it is probably meaningful to look at the comparison between his overall reasoning capabilities as represented by the general ability index versus his cognitive proficiency, or the efficiency with which he is able to do things. And just as I had mentioned before, when we think about that reasoning versus the efficiency component, there is that concept of creating a bottleneck, whether it comes from input or output or a combination thereof. Again, this bottleneck concept in terms of either getting the information in or showing what you learn can definitely cause a lot of issues in the classroom. So where do we go? Where do we go next? I'm going to actually go primarily into some of the suggestions that we have, here for intervention. I mean, I could do some of the additional WISC-V subtests. As I said, you're only seeing the WISC-V piece of this. You'll see all of the components that I looked at. But if I think about this and I look at the complementary subtests, for example, I could go ahead and do some rapid automatic naming measures, such as the naming speed. That's a very good predictor in both younger and older children of reading disorder. I certainly could, look at the naming speed quantity and look at some of the symbol translation. But again, I'm not really suspecting in this case that Sam has a specific reading disability. I haven't seen a huge number of errors in spelling in the written work that he's doing. So I'm not really thinking that he is a child necessarily with a specific learning disability in reading or mathematics. What I do see, of course, is that he has a number of specific attentional and concentration weaknesses, coupled with some behavioral manifestations and behavioral concerns in terms of very rigid thinking and possibly some obsessional kinds of thinking that's going on here. So again, I need to many times look at my specific battery and what is necessary and what else might be helpful to understand his needs. So I didn't necessarily need to do the additional WISC-V ancillary tests in this particular case. You'll see them in the report, again, mainly for instructional purposes. And what I really want you to think about is not just Sam, but think about your own cases and the students that you encounter. We see that, in many cases, we might have a child who's very slow but very accurate because there's perfectionism. We see in other cases that a child is very fast because that's the most important thing, and they aren't able to either recognize their errors or really consider things further. So as I said, now what? We know we've got a couple of things going on with Sam. We have some psychological processes, and I'm not going to specifically address whether or not I think Sam would qualify for other health impairment or specific learning disabilities. We don't have all the information here, and how different states define those specific criteria. We could have some different things going on here. But clearly he's having trouble within the classroom. And clearly those mental control difficulties have an impact. The attention has an impact. We're not seeing so much that there are sensory motor issues or language process issues that are really causing Sam to experience difficulty. So what do we know about Sam as a result of this evaluation? Well, with the WISC-V in about an hour, we know that his general cognitive abilities are intact. His overall reasoning and problem solving is very well developed. We know that his cognitive proficiency is less well developed, and we have really gotten some good information that he does better with a challenge. And so task difficulty may be a real element of motivation for him, or it could be that it's tipping him off. I'm hesitant to use the term motivation because it also is the recognition that he needs to focus and recruit the appropriate level of resources. So picture this. As you think about Sam and his ability to recruit the necessary resources to really focus his attention, we see that when he perceives something as easy, part of what may be going through his head here is, I got this, easy peasy. I know I'm smart. I don't have to worry. Versus, you want me to do what? I know I'm smart, but I better take it up a notch. And that really seemed to make a difference for Sam. And as we look at all of the information that you'll see within the overall report, we see that Sam is, as I said, rigid and perseverative in many of his behavioral patterns. He underestimates how long things will take and how much attention he has to regulate. And so these are some of the overlooked sources of difficulties that many students have in terms of initiating and completing the work. And when you think about the characteristics of many of the kids that you have worked with that have symptoms of ADHD, many times it's very puzzling because it's situationally specific. And you see that many kids with ADHD have a few, specific activities, certain activities in which they're able to focus their attention. They can do that pretty well for a long period of time. They can sustain their efforts, but it's also the case that they have other areas where they have much greater difficulty exercising the same skills in terms of regulation and so forth. So what are we suggesting for Sam? So these are some of the recommendations, although I use the term suggestions. I used to work in the due process office in a school system, so I'm a little bit hesitant on saying recommendations. But these are things that I think, as a psychologist who has analyzed the data, would be helpful for Sam. And certainly helping him to set his own limits, to assume responsibility for completing assignments, and really to be able to establish a more common understanding of rules and timeliness needs to be established and maintained. But it seems like for a child like Sam, having some challenge, starting things out by saying, I think you can finish this work in about 15 minutes. What do you think? And then setting a timer and see how he does. Assigning some of the tasks that are less repetitive, and thinking about how much practice is actually needed in order for Sam to be successful. We've already established that he has extremely well-developed reasoning skills. He does seem to be acquiring information. So this is the art and science of understanding how much practice and reinforcement of skills is necessary. We should definitely consider having Sam, as I said, take more responsibility in what happens when it comes to homework. There's some very interesting studies that have been done looking at assignment expert teams, for example, where students meet with the teacher to develop specific kinds of homework activities or classroom activities. How do we go about teaching that process of self-regulation in the classroom? And that self-directive process of a learner actually transforming his or her mental abilities into academic skills is important. And these skills and these processes need to be personalized for each type of an assignment. So these are some kinds of things that might be helpful. Using teaching self-monitoring and perhaps implementing some solution-focused brief counseling techniques might be very helpful in this situation. Obviously homework is something that needs to be carefully monitored at home, but I think that this is going to require quite a bit of collaboration and coordination between parents and teachers. So what I would like for you to do as we approach the end here, you can see that most of the interventions, and I just pulled out a few from the report, most of my interventions have focused around more of the executive functioning. And you might be thinking, well, did we need the WISC-V? For me, the WISC-V helped me to pinpoint where some of Sam's difficulties were. And as I think about whether Sam might be eligible for any services, I'm almost thinking that he seems in some ways like a 504 type of a kid. However, you would need to, in each individual situation, in each setting, take a look at the local regulations in terms of looking at the performance. But clearly, we do have a mismatch between what we would expect Sam to be doing in the classroom and what is actually happening in the classroom. And hopefully some of these interventions would be enough. So what I would like for you to do as part of a more continued learning experience is to be able to go and get a copy of the sample report for SAM. And as I said, this is the full report, not just a report of the WISC-V data. You can go to this website right here. You enter the password SAM, sign the guest book, add any intervention suggestions that you can think of based upon what you've seen in this report or in this session, and then download that full psychoeducational report. What I would like to be able to do is combine some of the suggestions that you all come up with and be able to share that further in another attachment that gets posted at this same website. So this is just a way for you to really process this information a little bit further and put your own spin on things. There are also a number of helpful resources that I would suggest. And this is just, again, a sampling of resources. One of the things that I think is especially pertinent in Sam's case is this resource from Dr. Tom Brown, Smart But Stuck, Emotions in Teens and Adults with ADHD. Sam is still young, but I see this as something to really be thinking about in his future. And again, some of these other resources are just if you're interested in looking at the brief solution-focused counseling, other issues with ADHD, some of the homework strategies that I was talking about. So I think in conclusion, we have about 2 minutes left, and I know there's still a lot of questions in here. I'm probably going to have to just get back to you with some responses. I know Dr. Kimball has responded to a lot of them, but we will definitely review these. The important consideration in conclusion, though, is that what I hope I've identified here is that, yes, I looked at the scores, and of course, I could see what the student was able to demonstrate. I still needed to do an awful lot to help people to understand how those scores were obtained. And part of what I do when I try to analyze and interpret results from something like the WISC-V is that I focus on the how, how Sam is approaching things. And as I said, the WISC-V gives us a good opportunity in a very standardized situation to see how a child performs. And then our analysis of that data is extremely important because it isn't just about the scores. It's about putting the whole picture together so that we see what a child is able to do and what he's not able to do.